Without water, there can be no life. But if water is the only thing you have to drink, can you really call that living? At some point, we as a species collectively answered no and went in search of other beverages. But when exactly did that happen? And what was the first alternative beverage? Well, today, we're getting to the bottom of when humans started drinking something other than water. The bottom of the glass, that is. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History Food channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what other major moments in drink history you would like to hear about next. Okay, hope you're thirsty for knowledge, because here we go. The Romans loved naming things after Caesar, like Caesar salad, Caesar's palace in Las Vegas, and the city of Caesarea, which they built 2,000 years ago in what is now Israel. The only problem was, there was no water at the site. Or was there? Well, yes, but only after the Romans constructed an aqueduct across the desert to carry water to the city. Their ability to build aqueducts and reservoirs to collect, control, and move water at such a scale is one of the things that made Rome capable of building and sustaining their incredible empire. That's because, before the development of such technology, it was difficult to impossible to create any kind of permanent settlement that wasn't situated near a body of water. Thanks to innovators like the Romans, today water is so readily available in much of the world that it's kinda boring. Water is what you order when there's nothing else on the menu you want to drink. It's gotten so dull, in fact, that supermarkets are now jam-packed with a near infinite variety of other options to quench your thirst. But which one was first? We pity the fool who don't like tea, and judging by the fact that it's literally the most popular drink in the world, we actually don't have that many people to pity, so pity us? In case the only tea you drink comes from a can, this ancient beverage is made by soaking the leaves from the tea plant, otherwise known as the Camellia sinensis, in freshly boiled water. Nobody knows who was the first person to figure that recipe out, but according to legend, it was someone from China around 2700 BCE. That person might also have been a doctor, because for thousands of years, tea was regarded as a medicinal drink. It wasn't actually until the 3rd century CE that someone decided it was okay to drink tea even if you weren't sick. And that's what really began the cultivation and processing of tea as we know it. The Chinese looped in the Japanese right around the 9th century and the island of Taiwan in 1810. But it was the Dutch East India Company who introduced the stuff to Europe in 1610. The British, as we all know, went absolutely mental for the stuff and introduced it to India in 1836. And by the early 20th century, tea was all over the place. They were growing it in Iran, Australia, Mozambique, Brazil, Georgia, and about 100 other places. The two main varieties of tea used today are the small-leaved China plant and the large-leaved Assam plant. And just for the record, the word chai means tea in Hindi. So if you order a chai tea, you're ordering a tea, and that's just fun to say. Despite what you may have heard, coffee was not invented by Baron von Starbucks. In fact, no one is 100% sure where or when coffee comes from. Wild coffee plants are generally believed to be native to Ethiopia, specifically a plateau region called Kaffa, which is the likely source of the word coffee. Legend has it that the guy who first realized there was something special about coffee was a goat herd named Kaldi, who tried some after observing the effect it had on his flock. Like everyone who loves coffee, Kaldi found that effect exhilarating.
Fresh in your coffee, sir?
Yeah, keep it coming.
And told pretty much anyone who would listen, which does sound exactly like a coffee drinker. It's a nice story, but the truth is coffee was probably known to Ethiopia nomadic tribes for thousands of years. But it wouldn't be until the 15th century that someone figured out that the seeds could and should be roasted. Right around the same time, some Sufi monks in Arabia, who were having trouble staying up all night to pray, figured out coffee could be brewed as a beverage. So on behalf of coffee drinkers all over the world, thanks, Sufi monks! 100 years later, there were coffee houses across the Arab world, presumably filled with students on their 36th hour of League of Legends. 150 years after that, coffee would spread across Europe in the late 20th century. European coffee houses quickly became places to exchange ideas and do business. For example, Lloyd's of London, today worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 billion, was founded in a coffee house. And you've heard of the French and American revolutions? Well, they too were greatly planned in coffee houses. And all 236 episodes of Friends took place at least partially in a coffee shop, which is the true measure of success.
Can I get you some coffee?
Decaf.
It's hard not to wonder about the first person who watched a calf suckling its mother's udders and thought, I gotta get me some of that. But whoever that little freak was, they probably didn't live that long ago, relatively speaking. Humans as we know them have only been bopping around the planet for about 300,000 years or so. The practice of drinking milk, on the other hand, only really goes back a mere 9,000 years, give or take. The first milk drinkers were likely early farmers who lived in what is now Western Europe. They were some of the first humans to live with domesticated livestock, including cows, which means they were also probably the first people to say moo. Today, milk is a common beverage in Europe, North America, and a whole bunch of other places. But not everyone can handle the stuff. That's because milk contains a sugar called lactose, and it's simply not something all of us are able to tolerate.
Milk was a bad choice.
When humans are still infants, our bodies make a special enzyme called lactase that digests lactose. Some people's bodies stop making that enzyme as they get older. And if you have the lousy luck to lack lactase, you're losing lactose, Lorenzo Lamas. Drinking milk while lactose intolerant can lead to a whole host of unpleasant symptoms, like flatulence, painful cramps, and diarrhea. The earliest milk drinkers probably experienced symptoms like those, but some of them evolved to be able to tolerate it. Known as lactase persistence, the ability is caused by a mutation in DNA. So if you can chug a jug of moo juice with no problem, you're technically a mutant. Wine improves with age, so if you're lucky enough to find a bottle of the first vintage ever, it would probably be the greatest tasting thing in history, because it would have been made 8,000 years ago. Yes, archaeological evidence suggests wine emerged around 6000 BCE in what is present-day Georgia. Hank Aaron would be proud. The creation of wine coincides with a period in history when a lot of nomadic peoples finally settled down to do some farming and homesteading. The increased stability gave them some spare time, and, as we all know, idle hands are the devil's workshop, and an underrated horror comedy. So these ex-nomads started experimenting with the fermentation process, and the next thing you know, bam, they invented wine. Obviously, it was a huge hit. The Persians got into the winemaking game about 1,000 years later, the Italians and Armenians about 1,000 years after that, and Francis Ford Coppola about 6,000 years after that. Wine was important in religious rituals of the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Jews, Christians, and others. But it was also a part of ancient secular social traditions. The Greek symposium, for example, was a portion of a banquet that took place after a meal. Wine was served, and there was music, dancing, or conversation. The overseer of the symposium was the symposiarch, the one who got to make the call on how strong the wine was. It was a pretty simple equation. If the host was going for erudite conversation, the wine was weaker. If it was going to be an evening of sensual debauchery, well, then it was time to break out the good stuff. Wine is fine, but beer is usually cheaper and much, much older. Archaeological evidence shows the Natufians were drinking a gruel-like beer in what is now Israel over 13,000 years ago. For instance, take Göbekli Tepe, an eerie Neolithic monument in the mountains of Turkey that might be the world's first temple. There's evidence suggesting they were making beer there at least as early as 8500 BCE. The world's first kegger. The earliest evidence for beer as we know it, which is to say beer made from barley, goes back to at least 3500 BCE and was found in a mountainous region of what is now Iran. The ancient Sumerians and Egyptians all drank beer. In fact, the workers who built the pyramids of Giza were mostly paid in beer, an arrangement we still honor to this day when we need our friends to help us move. Of course, any consideration of beer and wine needs to acknowledge the debt that both owe to what is almost certainly the oldest alcoholic drink on Earth, mead. Whereas beer is made from fermenting sugars taken from malted grains, and wine from sugars taken from fruits, mead is made from the sugar in honey. And while the oldest evidence for its human consumption is only 9,000 years old, mead is definitely way, way older. In fact, it has existed for as long as bees have been making honey. Basically, the bees abandon a hive, allowing the sun to melt the wax in its walls which seals the honey inside with rainwater and naturally occurring yeast. And then the mead just kinda happens all on its own. No human intervention required. Therefore, based on the archaeological evidence and the size of the booze section at Trader Joe's, the first non-water beverage was something alcoholic. And while we've been drinking beer and wine for a long time, thanks to our friends the bees, we've almost definitely been drinking mead a heck of a lot longer. So the question is, when did people start drinking something other than water? The answer is the day some lucky caveman stepped in an old beehive and discovered mead. Or just chugged it straight out of a live one. We've seen Oog do some crazy things when he's had one hive too many. So what do you think? What's your favorite alternate beverage? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other Weird History Food videos.